So despite no Kojima involvement, the Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater remake, and Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater, is finally here. And since I got to spend a few hours checking it out over my Labor Day weekend, I wanted to give my initial impressions as a longtime Kojima fan. Sadly, the original was relegated to my backlog over 2 decades ago, so I figured now would be a great time for me to finally work on filling in a pretty major gap in my Metal Gear Solid play history. Also, before we get started, I did want to say this impressions format is a little bit different than what I normally do here on the channel. What I mean is it's not heavily scripted and I'm mostly riffing some from basic bullet points, so if it does sound a little bit different, and by slightly different I mean a little bit disjointed, that would be why. And the reason I'm trying this out is because I'm trying to find a way to find that sweet spot between keeping regular releases flowing on the channel and, well, pretty much maintaining my sanity. Now, like I already mentioned, this game fell into my backlog back around its release, and even though I really enjoyed the time that I did spend with it back then, for whatever reason it was just a really busy period in my life, and even though I really enjoyed Metal Gear Solid 1, and to a lesser extent Metal Gear Solid 2 when I beat those games, this game just did not click with me immediately. Which honestly is pretty tragic, because by all accounts it's one of the best games in the entire series, and widely regarded as a classic by, well, more frantic fans than I am. And I decided I would go ahead and revisit it now because, well, it's a new release, and of course I was curious just to see what it would look like overall, but beyond that I just generally appreciate remakes and remasters, even if this one was a little bit conflicting for me. After all, Kojima wasn't involved with this project at all, which makes total sense given his very public split from Konami almost a decade ago at this point, and he actually already came out and said, "I'm not going to be playing this remake," which I do totally understand, but I also do feel kind of bad for the developers that worked so hard on this project because I'm sure a lot of them are huge Kojima fans as well. And to their credit, they did keep this incredibly faithful to the original, perhaps even a bit too faithful, but we'll get to those points in a little bit. For now, let's go ahead and take a look at the actual gameplay. And one of the things that I had kind of forgotten about this game is that it's a really slow start. At first I thought I would just play this game for an hour or two, kind of get my feet wet, that kind of thing, but then I kind of forgot that once you get started with this game, you've got about a 20-minute cutscene before you really get going, and I would say in that first hour you only play about a solid 10 or 15 minutes, and even that might be a little bit generous. It kicks off with Snake making the world's first Halo jump into hostile territory in 1964 on an extraction mission. And it's super exciting watching an unflappable Snake just sort of chilling on a Cold War era aircraft, smoking a cigar before jumping or, well, I guess falling into action. Once you're on the ground, you'll be treated to a vertical slice of sorts, outlining the basics of gameplay like equipping camo, how stamina and health management work, all while engaging with or sneaking by the enemies that you'll encounter as you work your way through the prologue. And if you've ever played a Metal Gear Solid game before, a lot of this will feel really familiar really quickly. You've got the standard loadout where you've got your items selectable on the left side of the screen while your weapons are selectable on the right side of the screen. And while I can't remember if this was actually in the original, I do like that you can hold up on the D-pad to quickly cycle through the different camo options that you have available without having to dig too deeply into the menus for that. Although I do kind of wish they'd added a long press on the touchpad to immediately bring up the map without having to manually select it each time, although to be fair, on occasion after you're given an objective, you can hold I think up on the D-pad as well as a contextual press to immediately get your bearings. Also, I probably should have mentioned this initially, but beyond those basics of sneaking and close quarters combat do come some new elements in Metal Gear Solid 3 if you're coming from MGS 1, 2, and maybe 4, and those would include things like the ability to manage your camouflage, patch yourself up with medical supplies to treat particularly brutal wounds, and also how the stamina and health systems work together in tandem. It sounds complex, but it's all pretty streamlined actually, and nowhere near the level of complexity you would get from something like, say, Death Stranding. And I have to say, if you are coming from this fresh from Metal Gear Solid 1 or Metal Gear Solid 2, and you're using this as a way to get reacclimated with the series after a long absence, it does feel just about perfect, like throwing on your favorite hoodie. Those classic menu navigation chimes are fully intact, and moving Snake around these lush jungle environments just feels great. But now let's talk about the visuals a little bit, because obviously that's a huge draw for this particular remake. Now I played this on the PlayStation 5 Pro, and based on Digital Foundry's analysis, it does have some frame rate issues and visual artifacting that actually make it a little bit worse than the regular PlayStation 5 version from what they found. But in my personal experience, it ran just great, and every lush jungle and dank cave I explored appeared pretty crisp, and even when I decided to forego stealth entirely in favor of going in loud and obnoxious, I didn't really notice any major performance dips. I'm not saying there weren't any, just that I'm probably not the most discerning player to suss out those dips in this particular case, but hey, if your experience has been different on the PS5 Pro hardware, let me know in the comments below. And beyond that, I believe Konami has already announced that performance patches are on the way, so there's a good chance if you do notice any weirdness on the PS5 Pro hardware, hopefully that will get sorted out in short order as Konami rushes to get a patch out. Also, the character models look fantastic, and it's nice that they've essentially kept the original voice lines, and it always brings a smile to my face to hear David Hayter's voice just nailing that balance between Snake's grizzled observations and that classic Kojima levity. And honestly, that kinda seems to be the order of the day from what I could tell playing this updated version of MGS 3, and also when I first dabbled in the original years ago. Even with only the most basic familiarity with this game, it feels like an incredibly safe remake, and that's probably for the best. Because when it comes to remaking a bona fide classic, you probably want to hedge your bets a little bit. Because while I remember how rabid the Silent Hill community was about Silent Hill 2 Remake when it was announced, I also remember a pretty vocal chunk of the player base who were appalled at Bloober Team even making the attempt, and they didn't get much kinder once the finished product hit storefronts. And obviously you can't please everybody, particularly on the internet, but all of this is to say that playing it a little bit safe was probably the right call here. There were some changes that I've heard about, but I'm not yet deep enough into the game to witness except for maybe one or two. Things like giving you the option to switch between the original bikini model posters or the updated images of all of the classic models who were actually tracked down by the developers to reappear in an updated form, which honestly I think that's a really nice touch. And it's pretty cool that those original models were willing to reappear here for what is essentially a bit of a gag. As the controls go, you can engage a modernized control scheme for a more over-the-shoulder approach, which is what I went for, and it doesn't seem like anything major about the experience is lost from using this. And it certainly felt more natural to me, even if the old school menu system feels a little bit dated at this point, but hey, it's still perfectly functional. Overall, it looks like they kept this very close to the original with only the most minor upgrades to the experience beyond the obvious visual overhaul, and I also very much appreciate that they did not shy away at all from making sure Kojima's name was front and center in that opening credit sequence. They did have one of those cultural disclaimers at the beginning about how this game was a product of its time and all that stuff, but honestly I'm not really sure who they were worried about offending, so that seemed a little bit unnecessary to me, but yeah, so far all seems in order with that classic Kojima weirdness intact, and I think that's my favorite part of playing this right now. Not to discredit the hard work of the developers that brought this game to life, but even without Kojima's direct involvement in this project, it still perfectly maintained every ounce of the charm and playfulness that he brings into pretty much all of his games. Even though you're playing this gruff, Cold War-era political thriller of a game that's really grounded in a lot of real history, Kojima never shies away from making sure the player's having a good time and certainly doesn't mind any silliness. This manifests in a variety of ways, from shooting little froggy or duck collectibles in the environment, to classic snake-in-a-box shenanigans, to extended codec conversations where Snake and Paramedic debate the merits of Godzilla's cultural impact. So in 2025, it's still as much a vehicle for Kojima to express his personal musings on art, politics, technology, and, well, humanity at large, as well as any other game from his catalog. And I absolutely love that. Kojima is always unapologetically himself in his work, and while that won't sit well with some people, personally I love his particular style of game making. You can tell Kojima obsesses over the details, but crucially he never lets those details get in the way of having fun. Because there's no reason you can't speak to real human experiences while also having ridiculously over-the-top physics action sequences or a boss that controls a swarm of hornets. At the end of the day, it's clear Kojima wanted to tell a compelling story, but also make sure you have a good time, sometimes reminding you directly not to take things too seriously. And I'm happy to report that the developers have managed to maintain pretty much all of that in the remake. Ultimately, I'm really loving what they've done here with the remake, and I'm very excited to finally wrap this one up and cross it off my backlog. Everything from Snake's ever-expanding toolbox of gadgets and weapons, to the playful environments that invite you to experiment in interesting ways, is as refreshing now as when it first released. And while some of the holdovers from the original, like the frequent loading screens between areas that feel a little bit too short, definitely feel like the product of a bygone era, it's still a top-tier action romp that shows just how well solid mechanics can stand the test of time. So I guess the best praise I can give this game in particular is to say that after these first few hours, I can't wait to finish it and hopefully put myself back on a Metal Gear Solid re-education, revisiting 1, 2, 4, and 5 later this year, and who knows, maybe I'll even get real crazy and redo the Twin Snakes as well. You know, the original Metal Gear Solid remake. But hey, what about you? Did you play the Metal Gear Solid 3 remake yet? And if so, what was your experience like? Are you a grizzled veteran returning to pour over it with a fine-tooth comb? Are you going in totally fresh and new with this one? Or are you somewhere in between like I am, where you're just kind of reacclimating to that world and maybe finishing it for the first time, even though you dabble with it in the past? Let me know in the comments below, and as far as what's coming up on the channel, speaking of revisiting 20-year-old classics, I have been revisiting the foggy town of Silent Hill 2 after spending this past week wrapping up New Game Plus, and I'm hard at work on an updated video about what I noticed on a second playthrough since it dropped last year. And beyond that, I'm also working on another video that explores the merits and missteps of remakes and remasters, since it feels like I've been playing a lot of those lately, so yeah, stay tuned for those. As always, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch videos here on the channel. It really means a lot to me. Have an amazing day, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.